Great. Okay, so welcome everybody to this webinar of Analytics for a Better World. It's a pleasure for me to introduce the speaker, Timothy Chan from University of Toronto. He's Associate Vice President and Vice Provost Strategic Initiatives at the University of Toronto. He's a well-known researcher in operational research, optimization, and applied machine learning, applications in healthcare and medicine, but also in sports and sustainability. And today it's about healthcare and medicine. I think it's a really fascinating topic. So we are looking forward, Timothy, to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Dick. Thank you for the kind invitation. I'm very happy to be presenting today here. Full screen this.
Okay. Oh yeah, I forgot to say that if you have questions, you can also ask them just when you have questions. So then raise your hand, and then I will ask Timothy to answer the question.
Okay. So does anyone know where this phrase comes from? Got milk? No. Okay. Maybe not as common in Europe, but this was a commercial in the, I think, early 90s in North America, and this is the commercial. Okay.
And that was the Vienna Wood Dance in D, one of my all-time favorites. And now let's make that random call with today's $10,000 question. It's a tough one. Who shot Alexander Hamilton in that famous duel? All right, let's go to the phones and see who's out there. Hello? Hello, for $10,000. Who shot... Excuse me? Hold on, let me get some milk. No! I'm afraid your time is almost up. I'm sorry, maybe next time.
Got milk.
So I remember this commercial from my childhood. It was one of my favorites. And then you might have seen kind of lots of follow-up posters with kind of famous, celebrities and so on with the milk mustache, kind of, essentially advertising for the dairy producers. I think this was in California somewhere. But anyway, when we started working on this project, we thought, okay, we need a catchy title for this work. And we thought, Got Milk is a good title. And we thought we were so smart with this title. And we did a Google Scholar search. And, there's literally hundreds of papers with titles that have some variation of Got Milk in the title. So this is the best. This is what we came up with. So we have a longer kind of title, but this is really the essence of the work. Okay, anyway, so this is a joint work with several people. I want to give a special acknowledgement to several folks before we begin. So Rafid is a former PhD student. Ian is a former PhD student. Rafid is now a professor in Ottawa. Ian is a professor now at NUS. Rachel, at the time, was a former master's student. Well, is a former master's student. She was a master's student, really was the driving force behind this work. And so she did an incredible job. And she's now a research associate working with me. And then Debbie and Sharon are nutritional scientists, a nurse, and a neonatologist slash pediatrician, respectively. And so they were really the kind of collaborators, the clinical collaborators on this project with us. Okay, so what is the focus of this work? So it is about human milk. And as you probably know, it is really the ideal nutrition for babies, especially babies that are born prematurely, preterm, because they are full of essential vitamins and minerals, macronutrients like fat and protein. I bold those because that's what we are going to focus on today, and a variety of other bioactive ingredients that are essential for proper growth and neural development of the babies. Globally, about 15 million babies are born preterm every year, and the vast majority of them do not get enough milk from their own mom, from their birth mom. And in that case, so mom's milk is the number one priority, and if you can't get enough from mom, the donor milk is really the recommended standard of care, more so than formula. This is a short video I took from the website of the milk bank in Toronto, and it just tells you a bit of a story from the perspective of one of the people whose babies benefited from the milk. Okay.
At 27 weeks, Thomas was born, and shortly at that time, I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in my liver. I started chemotherapy, and I wasn't able to produce milk. And so when Thomas was born, it was a very easy decision to give him the best start we could by using the donor milk program. We wanted him to have the best chance that he could possibly have, and having done lots of reading and research, we knew that breast milk was the way to go, and because I was ill, I was not able to make any at all. And so Thomas was 100% fed off the donor milk program. Oh, he's doing really well. The doctors are very happy with his growth. He's at 37 weeks, almost 37 weeks today, and so he's almost at term. When Thomas was born, he was 1 pound 13 ounces, and he's now 5 pounds. So he's done really, really well. Experiencing just some of the regular ups and downs that preemies have, but overall, he's had a fantastic start here. He's really starting to grow and get big and almost ready to go home. And we truly think it's because he had a great start on the breast milk program, for sure.
So as Sarah was alluding to here, there are these entities called milk banks, and so the milk banks basically collect and process and then distribute donor milk. So these would be moms who are currently breastfeeding their baby. They pump extra milk, and then they send it to these milk banks for processing and distribution. And so in Toronto, there is a milk bank, and that's the one that we worked with. The map on the right you see there, that shows the locations of all of the nonprofit milk banks in North America. So there's about, I think, 40 or so. And one of the key steps that these milk banks perform is around pooling donations. So the picture on the bottom, you see these big beakers, and they basically take milk from typically different moms, multiple moms, and they pool them together. And as OR people, we understand, the benefits in terms of reducing variability, but also in terms of the milk, it increases the variety of the bioactive components in the milk to have a more diverse set of nutrients for the babies. So on this pooling step, the practices actually vary quite widely from milk bank to milk bank. And one of the key factors is whether or not there is an available milk analyzer to use. So that's the device I show on the right-hand side there. So it basically does exactly as the name suggests. You can give it a sample of milk, and it analyzes it, and it'll basically give you a good estimate of the amount of protein and fat and other nutrients in the milk. The challenge is that analyzers are expensive, but even more so that analyzing is very resource intensive. If you have to analyze every donation that comes in the door, that takes a lot of time and effort. And because these milk banks are nonprofit, they generally don't have the resources to do that. And so more than half of all nonprofits don't actually have an analyzer or don't actually use one in routine operation. They might be used in research, but generally not in kind of routine production of the milk. And so without an analyzer, think about the challenge that these milk banks are facing. They need to somehow find a way to decide which, milk donations to pool together without much information about the nutritional content in the milk. So they basically use some very simple heuristic strategies. So one heuristic strategy is really focused on like FIFO, basically try and pool milk together that's older. And the goal there is not necessarily to optimize nutrition, but it's to minimize wastage of milk, because at least that's something that you can definitely control. There's other clinical studies that show that younger milk is a bit more protein rich, for example. So you might try and mix in some proportion of younger milk in the pool as well. But that's basically it, right? It's very high level ideas and heuristics that they're using to decide what milk to pool together. Okay, so our contribution is a data-driven optimization framework for donor milk pooling. The focus was to help nonprofit milk banks that don't have an analyzer to optimize the quality and consistency of their milk. And really, there's two, technical challenges, so to speak. So one is that we don't know the macronutrient values in every deposit. And this feels like a very obvious machine learning problem, right? If we can measure good variables and use to predict the macronutrient values, we can make some decisions with those. And then the second challenge is around how do we combine deposits, right? Even if we have this information. And hopefully you will recognize that this is in essence a blending problem of some kind, like that we might have seen in our first LP class. And there's some blending with uncertainty, essentially. Okay, so what did we do? So our framework, as I mentioned, we built basically a bunch of machine learning models to make predictions of macronutrient content in the donations. These predictions were used in optimization model to optimize the recipes for the pooling decisions. Then we built a large simulation model to basically simulate many weeks of operation of the milk bank. So think about kind of an inventory type situation where donations come in, and then we make predictions, we make recipes, we pull that out of the inventory, and then we just repeat on kind of a rolling basis. So we can simulate as long a horizon as we want. And we use really the simulation to, for example, fine-tune some of the hyperparameters in our overall model to see if the recipes that we're creating are good and are beating the baseline. Okay, and then the final step, which is one that I think was really a nice addition to this project and really helped convince the clinical collaborators of the value and impact of this work, is we got them to do a trial implementation at our milk bank. And basically we try and set up an experiment where we compare the before and after of the way they were doing it versus the way that we proposed doing it, and then measure relevant metrics. Okay, and so I'll tell you about that at the end. One quick note on the literature. So there's a lot of relevant literature that is related to this work. I won't go through all of it, but I do want to point out one paper in particular that was really the inspiration behind our work. So this is the third bullet here around OR and milk banking. There's actually only, as far as we know, one paper on this topic to date. This was work that was done by Lisa Maylert and Andrew Schaefer when Andrew was at Pittsburgh and Lisa's still at Pittsburgh. And Lisa came to visit Toronto, I don't know, 6 years ago now or something like that. And she gave a talk basically about this. And as a part of that, we invited the Toronto Milk Bank people to come and listen to her talk. She was working with a milk bank in the US. And so that's how I got to meet the Toronto people. And then from there, we started the collaboration. So I really owe this collaboration that I have to Lisa coming to give a talk and getting us all inspired to work on this area. Okay, so before I get into what we did, I'll just give you just a high-level overview of the process of what happens in the milk bank, so that you can understand a bit better what we did, how it fits into the overall process. So first step is screening and improving donors. So there's a very rigorous process before they can intake new donors. So you have to fill out some forms, you have to do a health screening, you have to do actually some lab work to qualify as a donor. Once you are approved as a donor, then our milk bank will send you basically these brown boxes. These brown boxes are insulated on the inside, they're empty, and then they come with these bags, or basically bags or other containers that are all be empty. And then basically as you're breastfeeding your baby and then you pump extra milk, then over time you fill up these bags, you store them in your freezer at home until you reach a certain volume, and at which point you can put it in these boxes, and then you can ship it, they'll FedEx it to the milk bank overnight free of charge. Then they arrive to the milk bank here on the left, and then the milk bank staff will basically take the bags or the bottles or however the milk comes in, they'll catalog them, they'll put them in inventory, and they'll start a series of tests to test for bacteria. Okay, so there's a first draw of a sample here to test for bacteria. Then after it gets cataloged, the milk goes into this freezer on the left-hand side here, where the milk basically stays until they're ready to be used in a pool. The night before the milk is to be put into a pool, they'll go into these silver fridges on the right-hand side, and they'll basically go there overnight to get defrosted. Then the next morning, they will pool the milk together. Okay. How do they decide what milk to pool together? They basically have literally they have 3 whiteboards in the milk bank. This is one of them. And this is the information that they enter on the whiteboard. So every row is a donor deposit. And it's very high level information around, whether this is an ongoing donor or not, whether what was the date of birth of the baby, how much bacteria is there, how much volume is in the milk, and then a few other variables that they could potentially look up in a separate, system, either on paper or on their kind of milk bank EMR. And basically, a human staring at this whiteboard needs to then decide on, a handful of donors and the corresponding volumes to pull from those donors in order to make a recipe. And then they write it down on a piece of paper like this. So this would be 5 donors. The main information is, the amount of volume to take from each donation to put together in that recipe for that day. Once the recipe is created and once the milk is defrosted, then they take those, let's say 5 donors worth of milk, and then they pool them together in these beakers. So every beaker basically gets an even volume. They put it on this magnetic stir plate. They stir it to homogenize the milk. They'll take another sample of the pooled milk for additional bacteria testing. And then once the milk is homogenized, they'll put the milk in these bottles. These bottles will get heat sealed and then put in these wire racks. And then the wire racks go in a pasteurizer. So this is thermal pasteurization. The milk basically gets heated up to kill the bacteria. And then after pasteurization, the milk gets labeled. And one sample bottle, again, gets taken for bacteria testing again, just to see if there's any residual bacteria left in the milk. And then these pasteurized bottles of milk will go in a separate freezer, this freezer, and get refrozen until it's ready to be shipped to some other hospital or some NICU that needs it for their babies. Okay, and one of the interesting things here that I didn't really realize when we started was, this is essentially a food product, so there's actually as you can imagine, in a hospital there's very strict protocols, but also as you're dealing with food, like you can't mix like food that's kind of before preparation with food that has been prepared afterwards. So you need separate freezers and separate kind of rooms to make sure that the flow of material is essentially in one direction only, so you don't contaminate. So anyway, lots of interesting kind of process related issues, but our focus is really going to be on that 3rd step where they pool donations together. Okay, so again, this is the summary of those 5 steps that I talked about. But we're focused on step 3. I just want to mention a few relevant things for steps 1, 2, and 3 for us. So in the process of screening and approving donors, we will be able to get information about the mom and about the baby. And these would be variables or covariates that we would use in our prediction models. When they come in to get cataloged, the milk gets assigned a 6-month expiration date. And so that expiration is an important part of any constraint around expiration. And then the last thing here around pooling is that the pasteurizer in our partner has a capacity of 18 liters, and they do 2 pasteurization runs a day. So they basically make one recipe of 36 liters, and they split it evenly into 2 pools of 18 liters a day. But the 2 pools are essentially identical. Okay. And to give you an idea of the, how this process unfolds over the course of a week, if you consider, week N, the week typically starts on the Wednesday, and we would create recipes on the day before, on the Tuesday, and the donations that are eligible to be used in week end have to arrive on the previous Friday or before. And that's because it takes time to get the bacteria information back, and we need that bacteria information before we can make recipes. Okay, so let me get into a little bit of the details of the model now. I wasn't sure kind of exactly what the audience for this seminar was, so there's a little bit of math. There's not too much math, but obviously if you want more details, I'm happy to share a paper with you offline that gets into more of the details. So the milk bank, the constraints of our model are really modeled on the operations of the milk bank. And so here we work closely with our collaborators to understand what their processes and operations were. So, you know, the pasteurizer capacity is 18 and they do 2 runs a day. So we basically, the recipe volume has to be between 36, and we give a little bit of a buffer, so 36.5 liters. They wanted between 3 and 5 donors in a recipe. So you want a certain amount at least in order to, again, have the diversity of ingredients in the milk, but you don't want too many because of increasing risk of bacteria contamination. This is actually a workload constraint. So if you use a deposit from a donor, then you should use between 5 and 18 liters. So for example, if a donor contributed 10 liters, then you can use anywhere from 5 to 10, but don't use like 1 liter because it just creates a lot of work for the staff to have to mix together lots of small deposits. So use a good amount of the deposit, else, you know, use it all if there's anything that's left. And if a deposit is not fully used, we should leave at least 5 liters for use in the future. The fourth, you know, no 2 recipes in the same week may use milk from the same donor. This is a bacteria consideration. So after the milk is pooled and pasteurized, it goes to check for bacteria. There's one type of bacteria that can survive pasteurization. And so basically, if that happens, if you find that milk is contaminated with that type of bacteria, and that donor is also potentially used the same, you know, later in the week, then that potentially puts other recipes at risk. And so this is one way to mitigate that risk. There's a constraint around bacteria pre-pasteurization that we have. There's a hard constraint around what we call soapy milk. So this is more of a subjective constraint where they survey the moms and ask them some qualitative questions in the intake process around, you know, certain smells and tastes and whether or not their baby has rejected milk in the past. And so they give a label to some of this milk, and there's a constraint around that. And then there's a constraint which I won't go into the details too much, but it's basically around using deposits that are closer to expiration. Okay, when we first started this, we didn't worry too much about this constraint. We didn't have constraint 3 either. And then as we were doing simulations and we were working with them to trial our results, they found that, you know, we were trying to, basically too much milk was expiring in simulation, and they really didn't like that. So they wanted us to try and use milk that was closer to expiration. So we have some kind of data-driven way to get at that constraint. Okay, so in terms of the performance metrics, these are really the 2 primary metrics that they cared about. So number 1 is what we call the pass rate, which is a measure of the quality of the milk. So this is simply a measure of whether or not a milk pool meets a certain threshold of fat and protein. So if it's greater than 3.6 for fat and greater than 0.9 for protein, you get a 1, otherwise you get a 0. And so we want to measure the total fraction of pools that meet this target. At the same time, we don't want it to be too high. And we don't want too much variability from day to day. And so the second criterion that they're really interested in is consistency of the milk. So here we just simply measured mean absolute deviation in the fat and protein across the pools from day to day, essentially. So given that these are the metrics they were really interested in, we basically created an objective function for our blending model that, you know, in essence is a massive piecewise linear penalty function. Okay, and so I'll go over a little bit the pieces of this function so that you can get a flavor for what we're penalizing. So the first 2 terms here are fat, and the second 2 terms are protein. Okay, Within the two terms for fat, one term basically penalizes going over the threshold, the target threshold, and then one term basically penalizes going under. Okay, so this first term here, V is the volume of the deposit. So V is a vector here. So and for every component I, it's the volume of deposit I that shows up that we put into recipe R. So this is our primary decision variable. The M hats, so the red quantities are things that we predict from our ML models. So M hat would be a predicted value of fat or protein in deposit I. Okay, and then so this first term here would be penalizing if we go under the target threshold M star. And then the second term would penalize if we go over the threshold M star. Because there are because we're more worried about being under, we have a hyperparameter beta, which is a value between 0 and 1 that we can tune. And it basically controls this trade-off between these two objectives. Right? So beta is 0, we don't care about going over at all. If beta is 1, then we care equally about going over and going under. And then anything in between, we basically put a more weight towards going under the threshold, penalizing going under. Okay. All three of these blue terms, beta, delta, and lambda, are basically optimization hyperparameters for our model. So these are things that we're tuning in our simulation model. So beta controls this trade-off. And then the other two, delta and lambda, these are basically to help us deal with prediction error, basically uncertainty in the prediction. So if our target is M star, we can tune a nudge factor that goes to M star plus delta. And so any delta from 0 to a positive number, we would be tuning. And then this regularization parameter, I note there are many robust optimization experts on the call. And so, as you know, there's a strong relationship between regularization and robust optimization. And so we can show that by adding this regularization term here, this is equivalent to a suitable robust optimization model dealing with uncertainty in the prediction. And so we add this term here, and again, we tune this to help regularize the problem. Okay, so that's the objective, and the constraints are basically what. So in essence, this is the model. This is the objective that we're solving. This is the objective of our model. These are the constraints that I showed you on the previous slide. We tried a variety of different ML models, regression-based models, tree-based models, and so on. It ended up being that the random forest models performed the best in terms of predicting fat and protein. We didn't care about interpretability here much. We just wanted a good prediction. We collected a bespoke data set from the milk bank, actually over multiple years, to train these ML models. So remember, they don't use an analyzer in regular operations. And so in order to get data to train the ML models, we had to collect our own data set. We had to borrow a research analyzer to analyze all of these samples and get ground truth labels for the milk. And then we used that to train the models. Because we collected our data over multiple years, actually, COVID kind of had an interruption in the middle. We did notice a bit of distribution shift in the data. So this isn't a vanilla RF model, but we have to tailor the loss function for the model to account for this distribution shift over time. And to give you an idea of some of the features, we were really looking at high-level features that the milk bank had ready access to. So baby age, the donor age, what the infant status, whether or not the baby was born early or not, the dates of the milk, and the volumes of the milk that were provided. Okay, so a lot of other, potentially important information that they don't easily have access to, we didn't use them. But we did do a separate ML study where we included a lot of additional features to see what was the best possible prediction that we could make. And it turned out that these features, by and large, were kind of key features that were that gave us most of the predictive power of kind of all of the features that we could possibly get. So we felt pretty confident moving forward here. Just to give you an idea, the MAPES for the models for protein, it was about 10%. For fat, it was about 20%. Fat is a bit harder to predict for a variety of reasons. Fat sticks to the containers. You don't always get an accurate sample of the fat measurement. So 10 to 20% MAPE is not, is not tremendous, but we thought for our application and what we saw in simulations, it was good enough for our purpose, and so we proceeded with these models. Okay. As I mentioned, the optimization hyperparameters, these beta, delta, lambdas, were tuned via simulation. So we did lots of simulation tests to compare our model to an oracle model. Basically, we could use, instead of the predicted fat and protein, we could use the true fat and protein, which is what we call our oracle model. And so we can see how close or how far we were to the performance of the oracle. We also compared it to a FIFO baseline, which mimics their current process, which is essentially use the oldest milk first. And so using this to simulate, we found that we could close the gap probably more than halfway between FIFO and oracle on fat and protein. Yeah, and then the FIFO model is, so if you recall, there's the seventh constraint is around expiration. We basically use the FIFO model as an auxiliary model to determine a parameter in the expiration. Basically, the FIFO model says, use kind of the oldest milk, and then we kind of look at what would have been used amongst the oldest milk, and we use that to basically set a constraint around the feasible region, which is to don't use any newer milk than that. Okay, yeah, and then we run this model, I think I alluded to in the past, we run this model once a week to create 7 days of recipes at a time. Okay, let me talk about now the implementation. So we did an implementation at our partner Milk Bank. This milk bank is a mid-sized nonprofit milk bank. It's one of about 40 in North America. So Dick, yesterday when we were talking, they said, ours was quite big relative to the one in the Netherlands. In the grand scheme of things in North America, ours is actually not that big, but it's about a mid-sized one. It services about 40 NICUs in Ontario, and now is starting to service more NICUs out in Eastern Canada as well. Every year, it processes about 8,000 liters of milk that come from about 700 new donors. And when we were implementing this experiment, essentially, we were running during regular operating conditions, which were far from a controlled experiment. So they were just doing this as conditions were evolving, and over time, we had to adapt some of our experimental setup to the evolving situation. And so to show you the timeline, we started this back in November of 2021, and we had a baseline period of close to 6 months where we simply observed the milk bank operating like normally, and we would measure their performance in terms of recipe creation time, their pass rates for fat and protein, their MAD of the fat and protein, etc. Then in phase 2, we had a warm-up period where we were now using our optimization model. We were basically showing them the recipes that we were creating and using this to get feedback from them about whether or not these recipes were good, if they saw any problems with it. And this was a critical piece to help us actually revise certain parts of the model. And then in phase 3 is when we really went live and we actually started measuring the performance of our models. So again, that was about 5.5 months there. And then at the end, we had a cool down period just to measure if there was any kind of shift by the end of the experiment. Okay. So before I show you the results of the experiment, I want to give you some context for the operations at the time in the milk bank. So this graph shows inventory in the milk bank, total volume of milk in inventory as a function of time. So remember, when we started this was in fall of 2021. So this is still during the COVID pandemic. At the time, what they had observed was that they had actually historically high volumes of milk in the milk bank. So 1,600 liters was considered quite high. They'd never seen numbers like that. And so what happened was by 3/4 of the way through phase 1, they said, we are going to move to 7 days a week pasteurization. So before then, it was only 6 days a week. And here they said, we're going to move to 7. And we said, wait a second. We are in the middle of an experiment here. Please don't change the experimental conditions that we are operating in. And they said, we understand that, but, too bad, we're running a real milk bank here. We need to kind of roll with the punches, and we need to adjust as we go. So fortunately, we had a bit of time. So basically during this period, we had to change the model. We had to re-simulate, we had to retune everything to get ready. And then, as you could expect, as we went from 6 to 7, now over the course of the remainder of the experiment, the milk volumes then start to decline. And it got to a point where late in the intervention period, in our period, the milk volumes were so low that we really couldn't even do 7 days a week anymore. And so we had to scale back to about 5 out of 7 to give the chance for the milk volumes to recover. But basically, the takeaway here is that with less and less milk, we are having a slightly more constrained problem in phase 3. The other graph I want to show you is this one. So this is not total volume, but this is the average volume of a donation that arrives. Okay, so any mom who sends in a deposit, on average, how much are they sending in? So again, this was a historic high of about 13 liters coming in. And then right around the time it switched over to our period, it dropped to 8 liters and then slowly increasing and increasing. Okay, does anyone have an idea of why there was a big drop off, like right here? This was April of 2022.
The end of COVID?
Essentially the end of COVID, yeah. So in Ontario, the government mandated COVID restrictions lifted that week. And basically the anecdotal information that we got from moms is that before, when the COVID restrictions in place, they had nothing to do but stay home and pump milk. And then after the COVID restrictions, people could go out again, and then they basically were not pumping as much. And we thought it was a joke until they actually went out and asked donors, and the donors basically confirmed this is what happened. So again, the takeaway here is this creates a slightly harder problem for us, because if you remember, some of our constraints in our model are a lower bound in terms of deposit volume that is included, right? So if the average is 13, that you have much more flexibility than if the average is 8 or 9. Okay, so anyway, despite some of these potential headwinds, it turned out that the results were quite positive. So we made roughly 140 recipes in the 2 phases. The fat pass rate previously was at 43%, 43.6, and then we increased it to about 57%, which is about a 30% increase. The protein pass rate went from 53% to 70%, again, roughly about a 30% increase. The simultaneously passing both thresholds, previously only 1 in 4 milk pools were passing both thresholds, and we got it to about 45%, which is about a 76% increase there. So they were very excited to see that. This, for MAD, it went down about 10% here, 29% here. So a less variation in the milk from day to day. As you would expect, the recipe creation time went down. So this was, again, human, staring at a whiteboard, trying to decide. This was basically us ingesting the data, hitting optimize on Gurobi, outputting the recipes and validating it. So it still took a couple of minutes, but it basically saved a lot of effort, and we were getting these benefits in terms of the milk quality. They were very concerned about wasting milk. Did our approach let more milk expire than their approach? And it turned out that we let very little milk expire compared to their approach. Part of it is, our milk volumes were lower, so there was actually less chance to let milk expire. But anyway, it turned out that that wasn't a big issue. Another concern was bacteria. So in both phases, 3 pools out of the 140 or so failed the bacteria threshold. So our hard constraint was 50. The actual failure criterion is 100. And so, even though the model creates a feasible solution, sometimes there's measurement error and so on, and so some batches fail. But basically, there was no increase in the failure rate before pasteurization. Bacillus cereus is that bacteria that I mentioned that it can survive, the one that can survive pasteurization, and it proliferates in the heat, and so you can't detect it until afterwards. And so here, again, we basically had the same failure rate in BC as in phase 1. And so the last thing to point out is that, you might think, did we get lucky in phase 3? Did we just get better milk quality in phase 3? But if you look at the fat and protein content of each donation that comes in the 2 periods, they're statistically indistinguishable from each other. These results are very promising. We wanted to make sure we could do as rigorous a comparison as we could. So we did do a time series analysis just to adjust for things like serial correlation between the observations and to adjust for temporal factors like the volume of milk, because we know that, despite these percentages being significantly greater, right, the samples are not IID, right? Because, the milk that you use one day is then not available for use the next day. And so we wanted to do a proper interrupted time series analysis just to verify that that these increases are real. And so we basically did a simple analysis where fat or protein is a function of the time since the start of the overall experiment, whether we're in the baseline period or the intervention period, and then the time since the start of the intervention period. So this would be a very standard ITS specification. But because we know that the volume was significantly declining over time, we have to adjust for the volume as well in the week that the pool is made. Okay, so this is the specification that we used, and visually, basically, what we see is that the milk that's performed. So one thing you see is that there's tons of variability, right, from week to week, from pool to pool, and a lot of that just comes from the fact that it's hard to predict these quantities. But overall, you do see that the milk quality in phase 3 is a definite shift up from the milk quality in phase 1, if we were to kind of project forward that counterfactual into phase 3. And if you look at the actual, if you're interested in the coefficients, I'll just show them here. But basically, the coefficients for intervention were significant, positive, and large. We did some robustness checks to test for autocorrelation as well, but the OLS and ARIMA models were essentially identical. So we feel very confident in the robustness of these results. And I think that I will wrap up here just by saying that, so we created this data-driven framework for donor milk pooling without an analyzer. We thought it was a pretty comprehensive project where we looked at prediction, optimization, simulation. We also have a theoretical analysis about the quality of our solutions to our optimization model in the paper. So I'm happy to refer you to that if you would like to see, and then the implementation at the very end. I think the real value here is around making a consistent and high quality recipe creation process that had measurable improvement. And the measurable was really important. I think if we had stopped at the simulation, I think, the clinicians they'd be like, okay, that sounds great. But until we actually implement it in practice, I think that's when they really can pay attention and see that there's a real impact and it actually works in the messy day-to-day clinical environment. So we thought that was quite critical to getting them to buy into this, and they're now in the process of working with us to try and do a permanent, long-term implementation beyond the trial that we ran. And just in terms of a higher level impact, I suppose, annually, when this will be in full-time kind of operation, then about 1,000 preterm infants in the province of Ontario every year would be receiving some amount of nutrient optimized milk from our milk bank. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this nutrient, having enough nutrients is strongly linked to improved neurodevelopmental outcomes. So I always tell people that, 20 years from now, hopefully we're going to have really smart babies coming out of Ontario. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Timothy. It's really fascinating. It's fantastic. Are there any questions? So I see a hand, but that's applause, I think. So you can directly use your microphone if you have a question. So maybe then I start with a question. So how easy do you think this is also can be used in maybe for other milk banks or in other countries? Yeah? So we're already discussing it for the Netherlands, for example.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, you know, assuming everybody here is an OR person, right? Like I think we know that the types of models that we build generally are both generalizable but tailored, right? So we tailor the model to the criteria and the constraints of our particular milk bank, but the concepts are very generalizable. And so I think the potential is quite high to use this elsewhere. I think you know, so for milk banks that don't have an analyzer, especially, I think it's very hard for them to make you know, reliably, consistently good milk. And so I think kind of the framework that we have here could be very beneficial. But for some milk banks, as you know, Dick, even those that have an analyzer and they do analyze the deposits, like just the optimization model alone will be very valuable for them, right? Our Oracle model basically achieves, you know, the Oracle model is limited only by the quality of the donations that are coming in, right? So whatever the donations are coming in, you're really able to really optimize the milk. So I think it is very generalizable. I think the main challenge, and the challenge that we're starting to see a little bit in our hospital, is like local implementation is challenging because, you know, a milk bank, if it's a standalone or even as a part of a hospital, they don't normally, I think, have the kind of IT and technical setup to support an implementation like this. It's a very different type of a product than they're used to. And so, you know, we haven't quite figured out how to do it yet, right? But thinking about how to make that part easy for a milk bank to take this and use it and integrate it with their systems, I think that is the big challenge.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, I see. Ilbin.
Hello, Tim. Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. So you collected pre-COVID data and also data during the COVID, and you mentioned distribution shift. So I'm just wondering what kind of distribution shift you observed and also how you handled that.
Yeah. So we actually started this back in, like, collecting data back in 2018, 2019. And then we took a pause here, and then we picked up here. So the main distribution shift was that fat went up and protein went up. Protein went up a little, but fat went up quite a bit. We're not sure why. None of the other covariates actually had any shift. So, you know, the age of donors that were donating, age of babies, you know, volumes of milk and so on, none of those things changed, but only the endpoints changed by a little bit. And so, but again, this, you know, the change here was still in like phase 1, right? So this wasn't like phase 3 was getting better milk than phase 1, but it was from, you know, pre-experiment to the start of experiment, it went up. And so basically what we did to deal with this distribution shift is we basically had a weighted loss function between the two time periods, and we used basically all of the old data plus like half of the more recent data, and we trained our model this way, and, you know, validated this parameter to weight between the two periods to deal with the distribution shift. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I have just one more question. So I'm wondering about the demand variability. So does the demand for milk vary a lot of time?
Yeah, that's a great
time?
question. Yeah, that's a great question.
Is that a real constraint for your problem?
Yeah, so interestingly, if you think about this as like, if you're trying to map this back to a traditional inventory problem, this is, it's a bit reversed. So in this sense, the inventory coming in is the kind of uncertainty, and the demand is pretty much fixed. And the reason is, so in reality, the demand isn't fixed, but the pasteurization capacity is fixed. So the amount of demand that we can service is really capped by how much milk we can pasteurize every day or every week. And so basically, if we have more pasteurization capacity, we could potentially give milk to more babies because there is, that demand out there. But as far as we are concerned, the demand that we are trying to address is simply this, 36 liters a day of milk that we're trying to make recipes for.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Other questions? So I have a technical question, Tim. So finally, the optimization model is a linear optimization model?
Sorry, integer linear.
Integer linear, yes, yeah. And how big and what's the time?
I in terms of numbers of variables and constraints, boy, I don't remember. Because there's lots of auxiliary variables and stuff for all of the constraints. So let's say the main variables, which are the volumes of milk that we put into recipe 1, right? So at any given time in the milk bank, there could be 100 to 200 deposits, so this vector would be of dimension 100 or so, and then we would be making 7 recipes at a time.
I see. Yeah,
that at least gives you a sense of the size of the key decision variables.
Yeah. Nice. Pijman, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tim, for a very nice presentation. Maybe very quick question, more on the practical side. If I remember correctly, you mentioned that there are 4 phases, where the last phase is the intervention. If I remember correctly, the second phase was something that you mentioned that is critical, and you adjust your model according to some observation that you had. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm trying to think which. I'm pretty sure it was the workload constraint. So I think what happened was when we were in this phase, when we started to make recipes here to show them to implement, right? What happened was some of our recipes had like very small volumes of milk because we were, as an optimization model does, right? It tries to optimize very finely. So it was recommending certain donors contribute small volumes to a recipe. And the feedback that we got from the diet technicians, the ones who are actually, doing the work, is that, number one, like sometimes that means defrosting potentially a small portion of the overall donation. And then also just, there's lots of checks and balances that are in this whole process. And then doing that for a small volume of milk was just seen as just not worth it. They wanted to use just kind of big, large volumes of milk that they could evenly distribute across those beakers that they were, mixing the milk in. And so because of that, we went back and we said, like, so what is the kind of typical heuristic that they use in order to decide how much volume of milk they put in? They basically said, why don't you make it so that take at least 5 liters? If you pick a donor, use at least 5 liters. So that was the constraint that was affected in that process. As I'm sure and many people here know, when you work with practitioners, right, there's always things in their head that it's hard to get them to write down, right? And then only when you show them a solution can they say, oh, this violates some hidden constraint that I didn't tell you about, right? And so
Correct.
So phase 2 is very important for us to tease out those hidden constraints, essentially.
Thanks, Nick. Very nice.
So I have a question. Do you think that maybe also, for example, for blood, this is also possible to use a method like this? So I'm also working together with a blood bank, but that's more about the supply chain. Have you thought about that?
Sorry, I missed the beginning. For blood. Okay.
Yeah.
So do they have a blending problem in blood? I'm not so.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I can also imagine that you have different blood of different qualities
yeah, I mean, if there is an analogous problem, I don't see why this couldn't be used. I mean, I don't know if it would be for blood like products directly, because maybe they have the opposite problem, right? They want to keep they don't want to mix A's and B's, for example, right? But maybe you want to, I don't know, would you pool different A-type bloods? I don't know. But if that was a problem there, I don't see why this couldn't also be used.
Yeah, because you only have many other sub groups within A and B and so on. So yeah, I'll certainly ask this to the blood bank people in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Erik.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for a great talk. I was wondering if you considered a stochastic programming version of your optimization model, in the sense that you would try from your random forest to extract a distribution of profiles and optimize
we
that.
tried a very simple stochastic programming model, partially to deal with the uncertainty, but also partially to deal with like a less myopic approach. Right, so instead of doing it 1 week at a time, we would solve a stochastic program that would be like this week plus, let's say 2 or 3 weeks out in the future. A practical consideration was my student didn't have a lot of time to investigate it, but we did try like some small stochastic programming models, like a 2-week model, like a 2-stage for over 2 weeks, and we found that the performance wasn't significantly better than this, and this was a simpler model to implement. But I certainly think that there could be more done that's a bit more dynamic and a bit more forward-looking.
Yeah, but I'm referring to the fact that right now you sort of tackle it from robust optimization point of view, where you predict the mean and then you robustify the mean, but you're using the mean inside a piecewise linear function.
Right.
So if you had really noise about that realized profile vector, you're sort of replacing using Jensen inequality right now in this.
That's true. That's a very good point. Yeah. So we haven't looked at trying to directly incorporate the uncertainty around that nutrient information into the model. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. So I think looking at the time, we have to stop here. So thanks again, Tim, for this fascinating work and presentation. Yeah, I'm looking forward to also to connect and to talk about also applications and use in other countries. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks everyone.
The next webinar will be in 2 months, but all of you will hear about that. And that next speaker is Paula Scapada. She's also here. So she will be the next speaker. Maybe you can already tell Paula what the topic is.
It's about flood mitigation in Southeast Asia to minimize congestion and damage to infrastructures in urban development.
Great.
So hope to see you all in 2 months.
We're looking forward to that. So thanks for your participation and see you in 2 months. Bye-bye.
Bye.